The morning broke cold and silver over the Spokane River Valley, mist clinging to the pines like something alive, something breathing. The air tasted of wet stone and cedar, sharp enough to cut the lungs of anyone foolish enough to rush. Out here, where the wilderness pressed close and civilization felt like a rumor, time moved differently. Days stretched long and quiet, measured not by clocks, but by the rhythm of water over rocks. The distant cry of hawks, the crackle of fire against the endless hush. Ada Finch stood in the doorway of her cabin, wiping her hands on a cloth-stained green from yarrow and comfrey. Her home sat tucked into a clearing at the forest's edge, small but sturdy, built by her father's hands before fever took him and left her alone. Smoke rose, thin and steady from the chimney, the only sign of life for miles. She was a woman built solid, broad-shouldered and strong-backed, the kind of frame that came from years of hauling water, chopping wood, grinding roots into medicine. Her face was plain, she knew that, had heard it said enough times to stop flinching. Her hair, dark and thick, she kept braided tight against her neck. Her hands, rough and capable, were the hands of someone who had learned early that survival meant work, and work meant silence. The town of Spokane Falls lay 6 miles south, a rough collection of trading posts, saloons, and supply stores where trappers and hunters came to sell pelts and drink away their loneliness. Ada went there once a month, no more, trading her medicines for flour, salt, and coffee. She knew what they said about her. Big Ada, they called her. Sometimes with pity, sometimes with the kind of casual cruelty that didn't need to raise its voice. A woman too large, too plain, too isolated to ever be wanted. She had stopped waiting for kindness years ago. What she had instead was purpose. Her remedies worked. Broken bones mended under her care. Fevers broke, infections cleared. Men came to her when they had no other choice, and she helped them without asking for gratitude. She had learned medicine from her mother, a quiet woman with careful hands who had died bringing Ada's brother into the world, a brother who lived only 3 days. Her father, grief-hollowed and distant, had taught her to read the forest, to know which bark stopped bleeding, which root eased pain, which leaf could draw poison from a wound. When he passed, she inherited not just the cabin, but the solitude that came with it. For a long time she told herself it was enough. The forest didn't judge. The river didn't whisper. Out here she could be useful without being seen, but loneliness, she had discovered, was a patient thing. It didn't announce itself. It simply settled in, quiet and cold, until one day she realized she hadn't spoken aloud in a week, that the sound of her own voice had become strange to her. She tried not to think about it, tried to lose herself in the work. Drying herbs, grinding powders, stitching torn flesh when the hunters brought her their wounded. She told herself she didn't need more. That wanting more was dangerous. The sun climbed higher, burning off the mist, and Ada turned back inside to check her stores. Winter was coming, and she needed to stock up on willow bark, dried mushrooms, bear grease for salves. She was bent over her workbench, counting jars, when she heard it. Hoofbeats, slow, uneven, labored. Her heart kicked once hard. No one came out this way unless they were lost or desperate. She stepped outside, shading her eyes against the glare. A horse emerged from the tree line, a big roan gelding, its coat dark with sweat. The man on its back swayed barely upright, one hand gripping the saddle horn, the other pressed against his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and wet, staining his shirt. His hat was gone, his face pale beneath days of stubble. He looked up, eyes unfocused, and for a moment she thought he might fall. Ada moved fast. She reached him just as he slid from the saddle, catching his weight with a grunt. He was heavy, all muscle and bone, and he smelled of gunpowder, leather, and sweat. She half dragged, half carried him toward the cabin, his boots scraping the dirt, his breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't ask questions. Questions could wait. Right now he was bleeding, and bleeding men died if you wasted time talking. Inside, she lowered him onto the table she used for surgeries, sweeping aside jars and tools with one arm. His eyes fluttered open, pale gray, sharp even through the pain. He tried to speak, but she shook her head. "Save it," she said, her voice rough from disuse. She cut away his shirt with her shears, exposing the wound, a bullet hole high on his left side, just below the ribs. The entry was clean, but there was no exit. The bullet was still inside. She worked quickly, hands steady, despite the hammering of her heart. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, threaded a needle, heated a blade in the fire. He watched her through half-closed eyes, jaw clenched, sweat beading on his forehead. When she pressed the blade into the wound to widen it, he bit down on the leather strap she'd shoved between his teeth, a low sound tearing from his throat. She found the bullet lodged against a rib, pried it free with forceps, dropped it into a tin bowl with a wet clink. Blood welled hot and fast, and she packed the wound with moss and yarrow, stitched it closed with careful, even pulls. By the time she finished, the sun had shifted, throwing long shadows across the floor. The man lay still, chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. She wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly aware of how close she was standing, of the heat radiating from his skin. He was tall, lean, built like someone who lived hard and alone. His hands were scarred, calloused, the hands of a man who knew how to kill and survive. She didn't recognize him, but she knew the type. A hunter, a trapper, someone who moved through the wilderness like a ghost. She stepped back, arms crossed, waiting. After a long moment, his eyes opened fully, focusing on her. His voice, when it came, was rough, barely more than a whisper. "Thank you," she shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "You would have died," she said simply. He nodded slowly, as if even that small movement cost him. "I know." Silence stretched between them, not hostile, but heavy. She wanted to ask who shot him, why, whether someone was coming after him. But she had learned long ago not to pry. Men like him carried their secrets close, and she had no right to them. Instead, she said, "You need rest. I will check the wound tonight." He tried to sit up, winced, and fell back. "Where am I?" he asked. "Spokane territory," she said. 6 miles north of the falls. "My name is Ada Finch. I am a healer." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gaze. "Cade Harrow," he said finally. "I hunt, trap sometimes. Mostly I just move." She nodded. "Well, you are not moving anywhere for a few days. That wound needs time." He didn't argue, which told her more than words could. He was too weak to fight, and he knew it. She covered him with a blanket, checked the fire, and stepped outside to tend to his horse. The animal was exhausted, ribs showing but not injured. She unsaddled it, rubbed it down, gave it water and a handful of oats. In the saddlebags she found a rifle, ammunition, dried meat, a bedroll. No letters, no photographs. Nothing personal. A man without ties. When she returned, Cade was asleep, his breathing deeper now, more steady. She sat by the fire, hands folded in her lap, and let herself look at him without fear of being seen. There was something in his face, even in sleep, that spoke of old pain, the kind that didn't heal with stitches. She recognized it because she carried it too. Loneliness, loss, the weight of being unwanted. Night fell and the forest filled with sounds. Owls called, distant and mournful. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled, answered by another. Ada sat by the fire, mending a torn shirt, needle flashing in the firelight. She thought about the man on her table, about the bullet she'd pulled from his side, about the way his eyes had held hers without flinching. Most men looked past her or through her as if she were part of the furniture. But Cade Harrow had looked at her like she was real. She told herself not to read too much into it. He was grateful, nothing more. Gratitude was not the same as seeing. And even if he did see her, what then? Men like him didn't stay. They drifted, chasing something or running from it, and women like her didn't follow. She had her cabin, her work, her small patch of earth. It was enough. It had to be. But as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, she found herself wondering what it might be like to not be alone. To have someone sit across from her at the table, to hear another voice in the morning, to be chosen, not out of desperation, but out of want. The thought scared her more than she expected. Want was dangerous. Want led to hope, and hope, she had learned, was the cruelest thing of all. She woke before dawn, stiff from sleeping in the chair. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was cold. She added wood, blew on the coals until flames caught, then checked on Cade. He was still asleep, but his color looked better, less gray. She touched his forehead gently. No fever, that was good. Infection was the real killer, more dangerous than the bullet itself. She made coffee, strong and bitter, and sat at the window watching the sky lighten. The forest was waking around her, birds calling, squirrels chattering in the pines. This was her favorite time of day, when the world felt new and full of possibility. But today it felt different. The cabin felt smaller with another person in it, and yet somehow less empty. She didn't know what to make of that. By mid-morning, Cade stirred. His eyes opened slowly, blinking against the light. He turned his head, wincing, and found her sitting nearby with a bowl of broth. She rose, brought it to him, helped him sit up enough to drink. He took it carefully, hands shaking slightly, and sipped. The broth was simple, venison and wild onion, but he drank it like it was the finest meal he'd ever tasted. When he finished, he handed the bowl back and met her eyes. "How long have I been here?" he asked. "A day and a night," she said. "You lost a lot of blood. You will be weak for a while." He nodded, jaw tight. "I need to move on soon." She frowned. "You will tear those stitches if you try to ride. Give it 3 days at least." He didn't answer, just stared at the ceiling, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands kept flexing. He was a man used to moving, to staying ahead of whatever chased him. Being still made him uneasy. She left him to rest and went outside to check her traps. The morning was bright and cool, the air crisp with the smell of pine and earth. She walked the familiar paths, checking snares, finding 2 rabbits and a grouse. She cleaned them by the river, the water icy and clear, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. This was her life. Simple, solitary, shaped by seasons and survival. She had made peace with it, or so she thought. But something had shifted. The cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage. When she returned, Cade was awake again, sitting up with effort, one hand pressed to his side. She could see the strain in his face, the way he was pushing through pain. Stubborn, she thought, but didn't say it. Instead, she set the rabbits on the table and began preparing them for stew. He watched her work, silent, and after a while he said, "You live here alone?" "Yes," she said without looking up. "My father built this cabin. He died 3 years ago." Cade was quiet for a moment. That is hard country for a woman alone. She paused, knife in hand, and turned to face him. "I manage," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. He held her gaze, and something in his expression softened. "I meant no offense. You are capable, more than most." The words caught her off guard. She looked away, heat rising to her cheeks. "Thank you," she said quietly. The day passed slowly. She made stew, changed his bandage, kept the fire going. He slept on and off, his body demanding rest even as his mind fought it. By evening he was stronger, able to sit at the table while she ate. He didn't eat much, his stomach still too unsettled, but he drank water and watched her with those steady grey eyes. She felt self-conscious under his gaze, aware of her rough hands, her plain dress, the way she filled the small space. She waited for the judgment, the dismissal, but it didn't come. He just looked at her like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. That night, she gave him her bed and made a pallet by the fire. He protested, said he could sleep on the floor, but she refused. "You are injured," she said firmly. "I am not." He relented, too tired to argue, and she listened to his breathing slow and deepen as he fell asleep. She lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it meant that a stranger's presence could make her feel both more alone and less lonely at the same time. The next morning, she woke to find him already up, standing by the window, one hand braced against the frame. He was looking out at the forest, his profile sharp in the early light. She sat up, alarmed. "You should be resting," she said. He didn't turn. "I have rested enough." She rose, crossed to him, and saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set. "What are you running from?" she asked quietly. He turned then, and for a moment she saw something roar in his eyes, something that looked like grief. "Nothing I can outrun," he said. She wanted to press, to ask more, but the look on his face stopped her. Instead, she said, "Then maybe you should stop running." He studied her for a long moment, and she felt the weight of his gaze, the way it seemed to see past her defenses. "Maybe," he said finally, but his voice was distant, like he didn't believe it. Over the next 2 days, Cade grew stronger. He moved around the cabin carefully, testing his limits, helping where he could. He chopped wood, slowly and with frequent pauses, but he did it. He mended a broken hinge on the door, replaced a cracked window pane. Ada watched him work, half annoyed, half grateful. She wasn't used to having help, wasn't sure how to accept it, but she had to admit it was easier with another pair of hands. They fell into a rhythm, quiet and unspoken. She cooked, he cleaned. She tended the fire, he hauled water. They didn't talk much, but the silences weren't uncomfortable. They were the kind of silences that came from two people who understood what it meant to be alone. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Cade said, "You are a good healer." "Where did you learn?" She told him about her mother, her father, the years spent gathering knowledge from the forest. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he nodded. "You saved my life. I will not forget that." She shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "You would have done the same." He shook his head. "No. Most people would have let me bleed out. You did not even know me." She looked at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "Does it matter?" she asked. "Knowing you," he held her gaze. "It should. But you did it anyway. That says more about you than anything else." The words settled over her, warm and strange. She wasn't used to being seen, really seen, and it frightened her how much she wanted more of it. She turned away, busying herself with the fire, but she could feel his eyes on her, steady and patient. That night, as she lay on her pallet, she thought about what he'd said, about how she'd helped him without knowing him, about how that mattered. She wondered if he understood that she'd done it not just because it was right, but because she was tired of being invisible. Because for once, someone needed her. Not just her skills, but her. On the third day, Cade announced he was ready to leave. Ada felt a strange tightness in her chest, but she didn't argue. She checked his wound one last time, satisfied that it was healing clean, and helped him pack his gear. He saddled his horse, moving slowly but steadily, and when he was ready, he turned to her. "I owe you," he said. She shook her head. "You owe me nothing. Just take care of yourself." He studied her for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised her. He reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and firm. "Thank you, Ada Finch, for everything." Her throat tightened and she nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He mounted his horse, tipped his hat, and rode away into the trees. She stood in the clearing, watching until he disappeared, and then she turned back to her cabin. It felt emptier than it had in years. She told herself it was foolish to feel this way, that he was just a stranger passing through, that she would forget him in time. But as she sat by the fire that night, alone once more, she knew she was lying to herself. Something had changed. The silence that had once been a comfort now felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. And for the first time in a long time, Ada Finch let herself cry. The days following Cade Harrow's departure crawled by with a heaviness Ada had not anticipated. She threw herself into her work with a fierceness that bordered on desperation, grinding herbs until her knuckles ached, scrubbing floors that were already clean, chopping enough firewood to last through 2 winters. The cabin felt too quiet. Now the silence no longer a familiar companion, but something accusatory. as if the walls themselves remembered the sound of another voice and mourned its absence. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that 3 days with a wounded stranger should not have left such a mark, but every time she passed the table where he had lain bleeding, every time she saw the chair where he had sat watching her work, something twisted painfully in her chest. The forest around her cabin continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human longing. Autumn was settling in deeper now, painting the aspens gold and sending the deer down from the high country. Ada checked her traps, harvested the last of her garden vegetables, smoked fish from the river. Her hands stayed busy, but her mind wandered to places she had forbidden it to go for years. She wondered where Cade had ridden, whether his wound was still healing properly, whether he thought of her at all, or if she had already faded into the background of his memory, like so many nameless towns and forgotten trails. She hated herself for wondering, hated the way hope had crept in through the cracks in her carefully constructed solitude. On the 5th day after his departure, she decided she needed to go into Spokane Falls. Her supplies were running low, and more importantly, she needed to be around people, needed to remind herself that the world was bigger than one wounded hunter and the foolish feelings he had stirred up. She hitched her mule to the small cart, loaded it with jars of salve, bundles of dried herbs, and a crate of the bitter root tea that helped with fever. The ride into town took most of the morning, the trail winding through dense pine forest before opening onto the rolling hills that surrounded the settlement. Spokane Falls was growing, she noticed. New buildings had gone up since her last visit, rough-hewn structures that still smelled of sap and ambition. The main street bustled with activity, trappers leading pack horses laden with pelts, merchants hawking goods from the backs of wagons, women in calico dresses picking their way through the mud. Ada guided her cart to the trading post, a sprawling log building that served as the hub of commerce for the entire territory. She climbed down, acutely aware of the eyes that followed her, the way conversations seemed to pause as she passed. Inside, the trading post smelled of coffee, tobacco, and leather. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with everything from ammunition to fabric, flour to patent medicines. The proprietor, a thick-bodied man named Thatcher with a beard like steel wool, nodded at her from behind the counter. "Miss Finch," he said, his tone neither warm nor cold. "What brings you down from your forest hideaway?" She bristled at the phrasing, but kept her voice even. "I have medicines to trade and supplies to purchase." He grunted, eyeing her goods with a practiced assessment. "Let me see what you have got." While Thatcher examined her wares, Ada became aware of voices drifting from the back of the store, where several men had gathered around a potbelly stove. She tried not to listen, but voices carried in the cavernous space, and certain words snagged her attention like fishhooks. "Harrow," one man was saying, a lean fellow with a drooping mustache. "Heard he got himself shot up near the Snake River. Gambling dispute," another added. "Men never could walk away from a card game." The first man chuckled. "Wonder if he is even still alive. Took a bullet to the ribs, they say. Probably bled out in some ravine." Ada's hands stilled on the jar she was holding. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she fought to keep her expression neutral. Thatcher was still examining her salves, oblivious to the conversation behind him. She wanted to turn around, to tell those men that Cade Harrow was very much alive, that she had pulled the bullet from his body with her own hands, that he had been strong enough to ride out 3 days later. But she held her tongue. Speaking would invite questions she had no desire to answer, would paint a target on both their reputations, in a town that fed on gossip like wolves on a fresh kill. Thatcher finished his assessment and named a price for her goods that was lower than she had hoped, but fair enough. She accepted without haggling, took her credit, and began gathering the supplies she needed. Flour, salt, coffee, a small bag of sugar that felt like a luxury. As she was selecting fabric for a new winter dress, a woman's voice cut through the general murmur of the store. "Well, now, if it is not our mountain healer come down to grace us with her presence." Ada turned to find Constance Merriweather, the doctor's wife, standing with two other women, all three dressed in the kind of finery that spoke of money and leisure. Constance was a handsome woman in her middle years, with dark hair piled high and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had a reputation for charity work, and an even stronger reputation for knowing everyone's business. "Mrs. Merriweather," Ada said with a polite nod. "Ladies, how fortunate we are that you make the journey into town," Constance continued, her voice sugary. "We so rarely see you. I hope all is well in your little wilderness sanctuary." The other women tittered, and Ada felt heat creep up her neck. "All is well, thank you. I keep busy with my work." "Oh, I'm certain you do," Constance said. "In fact, I heard the most interesting rumor just recently. Something about a wounded man seeking refuge at your cabin. My husband mentioned that several people saw a hunter's horse tied outside your door for days." Ada's stomach dropped, but she kept her face carefully blank. "I'm a healer, Mrs. Merriweather. Wounded men sometimes seek my help. That is the nature of my work." Of course, Constance agreed, but her eyes glittered with malicious curiosity. Still, a woman living alone, entertaining a man for days at a time. One must consider how such things appear. People talk, you understand. Ada felt anger flare hot in her chest, but she forced it down. Let them talk. "My conscience is clear." She turned back to her shopping, but Constance was not finished. "I only mention it out of concern for your reputation, dear. A woman in your position cannot afford scandal. You have so few prospects as it is." The words landed like a slap. Ada's hands clenched around the bolt of fabric she was holding, her knuckles going white. One of the other women, a younger thing with blonde ringlets, leaned in conspiratorially. "Is it true the man was Cade Harrow? I've heard he is quite striking, in a rough sort of way." Constance laughed, a brittle sound. "Striking, perhaps, but hardly the sort of man a respectable woman would encourage. He has a reputation, you know. Gambling, fighting, running with rough company. Not to mention," she lowered her voice theatrically, "they say he killed a man in Montana over a woman. Had to flee before the law caught up with him." Ada's breath caught. She did not know if the story was true, did not know enough about Cade's past to defend him, but something in her rebelled against the casual cruelty of these women, the way they picked apart a man's life like vultures on a carcass. She set down the fabric, turned to face them fully, and spoke in a voice that was low and steady. "Whatever Cade Harrow may or may not have done is none of my concern, and certainly none of yours. He came to me injured, I treated his wounds, and he left. That is the entirety of the story. Now, if you will excuse me, I have business to conclude." She turned away, but Constance's voice followed her, sharp and cutting. "Such loyalty for a stranger, Ada. One might think you had grown attached. Do take care. Men like that do not settle down with women like us. They use and they leave, and you would do well to remember that before you embarrass yourself further." Ada did not respond, did not give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the words cut. She completed her purchases in silence, settled her account with Thatcher, and loaded her cart with hands that shook only slightly. By the time she climbed onto the seat and took up the reins, her face was hot with suppressed tears, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not where anyone could see. The ride back to her cabin felt twice as long as the journey into town. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the trail seemed rougher, every rut and stone jarring through the cart's worn suspension. Ada's mind churned with anger and humiliation, replaying Constance's words, the laughter of the other women, the pitying looks from the men who had overheard. She had lived with gossip her entire life, had learned to let it slide off like water from oiled canvas. But this felt different. This time, the gossip touched something tender, something she had not even realized was exposed until it was prodded. By the time she reached her clearing, the sun was sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. She unhitched the mule, unloaded her supplies, and went through the mechanical motions of settling in for the evening. She built up the fire, set water to boil, began preparing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. But her hands moved without thought, her mind elsewhere. She kept thinking about what Constance had said about Cade, about his reputation, about the killing in Montana. She did not know what to believe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The man who had sat in her cabin, who had thanked her with such quiet sincerity, had not seemed like a murderer. But then, what did she know of men and their hidden violence? Night fell, and with it came a wind that rattled the shutters and sent pine needles skittering across the roof. Ada sat by the fire, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, and let herself feel the full weight of her loneliness. It was not just the absence of Cade, though that was part of it. It was the realization that in 3 days a wounded stranger had made her feel more seen, more valued than years of living in this community ever had. And now he was gone, and she was left with nothing but gossip and the hollow echo of what might have been. She was pulled from her brooding by a sound outside, faint but distinct, hoofbeats. Her heart leapt before her mind could catch up, open fear tangling together in her chest. She rose quickly, crossed to the window, and peered out into the darkness. A rider was approaching, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. For a moment her breath caught, thinking it might be Cade returned. But as the figure drew closer, she saw it was a different horse, a different rider. Smaller, slighter, moving with urgency. She grabbed the rifle from above the door and stepped outside, keeping the weapon lowered but ready. The rider saw her and called out, voice high and panicked. "Miss Finch, please, I need your help." Ada recognized the voice now. It belonged to Thomas Ridley, a boy of perhaps 16 who worked at the livery in town. She lowered the rifle and hurried forward as he dismounted, nearly falling in his haste. "Thomas, what has happened?" "Are you hurt?" "Not me," he gasped, chest heaving. "It is my sister, Mary. She is in a bad way, Miss Finch. The baby is coming wrong, and my ma does not know what to do. The midwife is gone to Coeur d'Alene and will not be back for days. Please, you have to come." Ada's mind shifted instantly into the clear, focused calm that came with medical emergencies. "How long has she been laboring?" "Since this morning," Thomas said, tears streaking his dusty face. "She is so tired, Miss Finch. There is so much blood." Ada did not hesitate. She ran back into the cabin, grabbed her medical bag, stuffed it with everything she might need for a difficult birth: clean linens, herbs to stop bleeding, instruments for turning a baby. She threw on her heavy cloak, extinguished the fire, and locked the cabin. Within minutes, she had saddled her own horse and was following Thomas back down the trail toward town, the night air cold against her face, her heart pounding with a different kind of urgency now. A life hung in the balance, maybe 2, and whatever hurt she carried from the afternoon's humiliations would have to wait. They rode hard, the horse's hooves drumming a desperate rhythm against the packed earth. Thomas led her not into the main part of town, but to a cluster of rough cabins on the eastern edge, where the poorest families made their homes. He pulled up in front of a structure that was more shack than house, light spilling from the gaps in the walls, voices raised in distress from within. Ada dismounted, grabbed her bag, and followed Thomas inside. The cabin was cramped and smoky, lit by a single lamp and a struggling fire. On a narrow bed in the corner lay a young woman, no more than 18, her face pale and slick with sweat, her body racked with contractions. An older woman, Thomas's mother, hovered nearby, wringing her hands. "Oh, thank the Lord you have come," she cried. "I did not know what else to do." Ada moved to the bedside, set down her bag, and took the girl's hand. "Mary," she said gently, "my name is Ada. I am here to help you. Can you hear me?" Mary's eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain and exhaustion. "It hurts so much," she whimpered. "I cannot do this." "Yes, you can," Ada said firmly, "but I need you to trust me." "Can you do that?" Mary nodded weakly, and Ada turned to Mrs. Ridley. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and more light. Bring every lamp you have." The woman scurried to obey, and Ada washed her hands, then examined Mary. What she found made her stomach clench. The baby was breech, feet first, and the cord was wrapped around its body. This was exactly the kind of birth that killed mothers and infants alike, especially out here where help was scarce and options limited. But Ada had seen worse, had pulled babies from impossible positions before, and she would not let this young woman die if there was anything in her power to prevent it. She worked through the night, her hands steady, even as her mind calculated risks and possibilities. She gave Mary herbs to strengthen contractions, massaged her belly to try to shift the baby's position, talked to her in a low, constant stream of encouragement. Thomas and his mother hovered at the edges of the room, pale and terrified, but Ada blocked them out. There was only the work, only the life struggling to enter the world, and the woman struggling to deliver it. Hours passed, measured in contractions and prayers. Mary screamed, wept, begged for it to end, but Ada held firm, guiding her through each wave of pain. Finally, as the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the walls, Ada felt the baby shift. She worked quickly, carefully, easing the tiny body around, untangling the cord, guiding the feet, then the legs, then finally the torso and head. The baby emerged in a rush of blood and fluid, silent and terrifyingly still. Ada's heart lurched, but she did not panic. She cleared the infant's mouth and nose, rubbed its chest vigorously, breathed gently into its tiny lungs. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing happened. Then the baby gasped, choked, and let out a thin, wavering cry. The sound filled the cabin like a benediction, and Mrs. Ridley burst into tears. Ada wrapped the baby in a clean cloth, checked to make sure everything was as it should be, then placed the infant in Mary's arms. The young mother, exhausted beyond words, looked down at her child with wonder. Ada turned her attention back to Mary, checking for tears, pressing on her belly to deliver the afterbirth, watching carefully for signs of excessive bleeding. It took another hour to ensure that both mother and child were stable, to clean and dress Mary, to make sure she could nurse. By the time Ada was satisfied, the sun was fully up, and she was swaying on her feet with exhaustion. Mrs. Ridley pressed coins into her hand, far more than Ada would have asked for, and thanked her with tears streaming down her weathered face. "You saved them both," she kept saying. "God bless you, Miss Finch." Ada accepted the gratitude quietly, packed her bag, and stepped outside into the cool morning air. Thomas had already saddled her horse, and he stood holding the reins, his young face serious. "Thank you," he said simply. "I will not forget what you did." She nodded, too tired for words, and mounted. The ride back to her cabin passed in a haze of fatigue, but beneath the exhaustion, she felt something else: purpose, worth. The knowledge that whatever Constance Merriweather and her ilk thought of her, she had value. She saved lives. She mattered. When she finally reached her clearing, the cabin looked exactly as she had left it, patient and waiting. She unsaddled her horse, stumbled inside, and collapsed onto her bed without even removing her boots. She slept through the day and into the evening, dreamless and deep. When she woke, it was to the sound of rain on the roof and the hollow ache of hunger. She rose stiffly, lit the lamp, and set about making a simple meal. As she worked, her mind drifted back to Cade, to the rumors she had heard in town, to the way he had looked at her before riding away. She wondered if she would ever see him again, if he thought of her at all, or if she was just another stop on an endless road. 3 days later, as she was hanging laundry on the line behind her cabin, she heard hoofbeats again. This time her heart did not leap. She had learned not to hope. But when she turned, there he was, Cade Harrow, sitting tall in the saddle, his face shadowed by his hat, his grey eyes finding hers across the clearing. He dismounted slowly, favoring his wounded side, and walked toward her. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he said, his voice rough as gravel, "I tried to stay away." Ada stood frozen, with a wet sheet hanging from her hands, water dripping onto the grass. Her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. Cade Harrow looked different than she remembered, thinner perhaps, or maybe just more worn, as if the days since his departure had carved something away from him. His shirt was clean but faded, his hat darker with trail dust, and the way he held himself told her the wound still pained him, even if he would never admit it. She let the sheet fall back into the basket and wiped her hands on her apron, buying herself a moment to gather words that seemed to have scattered like startled birds. "I tried to stay away," he repeated, his voice carrying across the small distance between them. "Rode north for 2 days, told myself you had done your part, and I had no right to come back. But the wound started bleeding again, and I realized I was using it as an excuse. Truth is, I just wanted to see you." The honesty in his words struck her like a physical blow, and she felt her carefully constructed defenses crack. She wanted to be angry with him for leaving, for making her feel his absence so keenly, for returning now when she had almost convinced herself she could forget. But anger would not come. Instead, what rose up in her chest was something dangerously close to joy, and that terrified her more than any emotion she had felt in years. "Your wound opened," she said, latching onto the practical because the practical was safe. "You should have been more careful. You should not have ridden so hard." He smiled then, a small crooked thing that did not quite reach his eyes. "Always the healer first. That is what I admire about you, Ada. You see a problem and you fix it. No judgment, no hesitation." She shook her head, moving toward him now. "It is not admiration you need. It is common sense. Come inside and let me look at it." He followed her into the cabin, and the familiarity of his presence in her space made something in her chest tighten. She gestured to the chair by the table, the same chair he had occupied before, and set about gathering her supplies. Clean water, fresh bandages, the salve she made from bear grease and calendula. He removed his shirt without being asked, and she saw that he had been right. The wound had reopened along one edge, not badly, but enough to seep through his makeshift bandage. She cleaned it in silence, her hands steady even though her heart hammered. This close, she could smell him, leather and wood smoke and something else, something distinctly him. His skin was warm under her fingers, the muscle beneath it hard and defined. She had touched many bodies in her work as a healer, had seen men in far more compromising states, but this felt different. Every point of contact seemed charged with meaning she did not know how to interpret. When she finished, she stepped back quickly, needing distance. "You tore 2 stitches, she said. "I will have to redo them." He nodded, jaw tight. "Do what you need to do." She threaded her needle, heated it in the lamp flame, and worked quickly. He did not flinch, did not make a sound, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the edge of the chair. When it was done, she bandaged him properly and finally allowed herself to step back and really look at him. "Why did you come back, Cade? And do not tell me it was just for the wound. We both know you could have found help elsewhere." He met her eyes, and the rawness she saw there made her breath catch. "Because I have been alone for so long, I forgot what it felt like to be seen. And then you looked at me like I was worth saving, not just from the bullet, but from everything else. I've been running from that feeling for 3 days, and I am tired of running." The words hung between them, heavy and impossible. Ada felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She turned away, busying herself with putting away her supplies, needing to move, to do something with the energy coursing through her. "You do not know me," she said, her voice rough. "You do not know what you are saying. 3 days in my cabin does not make you understand who I am or what my life is." He stood, slowly, and she heard him move closer, though she did not turn. "Then let me know you," he said quietly. "Let me stay long enough to understand. I've got nowhere else to be, Ada. Nowhere else I want to be." She spun to face him then, anger finally breaking through. "And what happens when you get restless, when the winter closes in, and you remember why you prefer to keep moving? What happens when you realize that a woman like me is not worth the trouble of staying?" His face darkened, and for the first time she saw anger in him too. "A woman like you," he repeated. "What does that mean?" She gestured at herself, at her broad shoulders and thick waist, at the plain dress and work-roughened hands. "You know what it means. The whole town knows what it means. I heard them talking about you in Spokane Falls, about us. They think I am pathetic for even entertaining the idea that someone like you might see something in someone like me." Cade's jaw clenched, and he took a step closer. "I do not give a damn what the town thinks, and neither should you." He reached out, hesitated, then took her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm. "I see you, Ada Finch. I see a woman who pulled a bullet out of a stranger without asking questions. I see someone who lives alone in the wilderness and thrives. I see strength and kindness, and a courage most men I have known do not possess. If the town cannot see that, then they are blind and stupid, and their opinions are not worth the air it takes to speak them." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But years of being overlooked, of being dismissed, had built walls that could not be torn down with pretty words, no matter how sincere they sounded. "I need time," she said finally, pulling her hand back. "I need to think." He nodded slowly. "I can give you time. I will camp by the river, stay out of your way. But I am not leaving the territory, Ada, not unless you tell me you want me gone for good." She met his eyes, searching for deception and finding none. "Stay at the river then, but do not come to the cabin unless I send for you." He accepted this with a single nod, collected his shirt, and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back. "Thank you for fixing the wound, and for not sending me away entirely. That is more than I probably deserve." After he left, Ada sank into the chair he had vacated, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. The cabin felt emptier than it had before he arrived, as if his presence had expanded to fill it, and his absence now left a void. She sat there as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, as shadows lengthened and the forest outside began its evening chorus. She thought about his words, about being seen, about the way his hand had felt around hers. She thought about Constance Merriweather's warning, about the gossip that had already started. And she thought about her own heart, locked away for so long she'd almost forgotten it was there. The next 3 days were strange and suspended, existing in a space between decision and indecision. Ada went about her work, harvesting the last of her herbs before the first frost, smoking fish, preparing for winter. But she was acutely aware of Cade's presence down by the river, of the thin column of smoke from his campfire visible through the trees. She did not go to him, but twice she left food on a stump halfway between the cabin and the river, venison stew in a covered pot, fresh bread wrapped in cloth. Both times the containers came back clean and empty, left in the same spot with a small pile of firewood stacked neatly beside them. On the 4th day, she woke to find frost glittering on the grass and her breath misting in the cold air. Winter was coming faster than she had anticipated. She spent the morning reinforcing the cabin's chinking, stuffing moss and mud into gaps between the logs. She was on the roof, hammering down a loose shingle, when she heard voices from the trail, male voices rough and carrying. Her stomach tightened with unease. She climbed down quickly and had just reached the ground when 3 men rode into her clearing. They were strangers to her, hard-faced men with the look of those who lived outside the law. The one in front was older, maybe 50, with a scarred face and eyes like chips of flint. The other 2 were younger, one thin and weasel-like, the other broad and mean-looking. They reined in their horses, and the leader smiled, showing teeth that were more gaps than enamel. "Well now," he said, "this must be the healer woman we heard about in town." Ada's hand moved instinctively toward the pocket of her apron, where she kept a small skinning knife. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The word gentleman came out flat, making it clear she did not consider them such. The leader dismounted, his companions following suit. "We are looking for someone," he said. "Man named Cade Harrow. Heard he might have passed through here." "You've seen him." Ada's mind raced. She thought about lying, but something told her these men would know. She settled for partial truth. "He came here wounded. I treated him. He left." The leader's eyes narrowed. "When a week ago," she said. "Maybe more. I do not keep close track of time." The thin man spat in the dirt. "She is lying, Pike. I can smell it." The leader, Pike apparently, held up a hand. "Now, miss, I do not think you are being entirely honest with us. See, we have business with Harrow. He took something that belongs to us, and we aim to get it back." Ada lifted her chin. "I do not know what you are talking about. And even if I did, I would not tell you." Pike's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "That is a brave thing to say to 3 armed men." His hand rested on the pistol at his hip. Maybe you need some encouragement to remember better." Before Ada could respond, another voice cut through the clearing, cold and level. "Touch her and you are dead where you stand." All four of them turned. Cade stood at the edge of the trees, his rifle raised and aimed, his face hard as stone. Pike's expression shifted, surprise giving way to ugly satisfaction. "There you are, Harrow. Been looking for you." Cade did not lower the rifle. "I know why you are here." "The answer is no. You are not getting it back." What transpired next happened so fast, Ada barely had time to process it. The broad man went for his gun, and Cade fired. The shot cracked through the clearing, and the man went down, clutching his shoulder. The thin one froze, hands raised. Pike turned his attention back to Cade, his own weapon now drawn. "You are making a mistake," he said. "That money was not yours to take." Cade's voice was flat, emotionless. "It was payment for a job I did. You refused to pay, so I took what I was owed. That is not stealing. That is collecting a debt." Pike laughed, a harsh sound. "You think you can shoot your way out of this? There are 3 of us, and 1 of you." "2 of you now," Ada said, and she was holding her father's old shotgun, the one she kept loaded above the door. The weapon was heavy and her arms shook slightly, but her voice was steady. "And I do not miss at this range." Pike's eyes darted between them, calculating odds. The wounded man was groaning in the dirt, and the thin one looked ready to bolt. Finally, Pike lowered his gun, his face twisted with rage. "This is not over, Harrow. We will find you again." Cade's expression did not change. "You are welcome to try, but if I see you near this woman's property again, I will not aim for the shoulder. Do we understand each other?" Pike jerked his head at his men. They mounted up, the wounded one needing help, and rode out of the clearing at a gallop. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of Ada's ragged breathing. She lowered the shotgun, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. Cade crossed to her quickly, took the weapon from her shaking grip. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, unable to speak. He set the shotgun aside and pulled her into his arms, and she went without resistance, pressing her face against his chest. His heart hammered beneath her ear as fast as her own. "I am sorry," he said into her hair. "I am so sorry. I never meant to bring trouble to your door." She pulled back, anger flaring. "What did you do, Cade? What did you take from them?" He met her eyes, and she saw shame there and regret. "I worked for Pike 3 months ago, tracking a gang that had stolen horses from a ranch near the Snake River. We caught them, returned the horses, and the rancher paid us. Pike tried to keep my share, said I had not done enough to earn it. So I took it from him while he slept and left. It was my money, Ada. I earned it. But men like Pike do not forgive being outsmarted. And now they know where I live," she said. "They know you care enough about me to protect me. You have painted a target on both of us." He flinched as if she had struck him. "I know. And if you want me to leave, to draw them away from here, I will. I will ride out tonight and make sure they follow me." She stared at him, at the genuine anguish in his face, and felt her anger drain away. It was replaced by something more complicated, a tangle of fear and frustration, and something that felt dangerously like love. "If you leave," she said slowly, "they might follow. Or they might come back here looking for leverage. Either way, I am not safe." His face went pale. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that running will not solve this." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm saying that maybe it is time to stop running. Both of us." He stared at her. "You want me to stay? Despite everything, despite the danger." She met his gaze squarely. "I want you to stay and help me fortify this cabin. I want you to teach me to shoot better than I do. I want us to be ready if Pike comes back. And after that," she paused, her heart in her throat, "after that we will see what happens." A slow smile spread across Cade's face, the first real smile she had seen from him. "You are the bravest person I have ever met," he said softly. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, reinforcing doors, checking sight lines, moving supplies. Cade showed her how to load and fire his rifle properly, how to aim, how to breathe through the shot. They barely spoke, but the silence was comfortable now. The silence of 2 people working toward a common goal. When darkness fell, Cade built up the fire and made coffee while Ada prepared a meal. They ate together at the table, and for the first time since his return, the tension between them eased into something that felt almost like partnership. As they cleaned up after the meal, Cade said, "Tell me about your family." "About growing up here?" So she did. She told him about her father, a quiet man who had loved the forest more than town life. About her mother, gone too soon, and the brother she had never known. She told him about learning to heal, about the satisfaction of seeing a wound close clean, a fever break. And slowly, hesitantly, she told him about the loneliness, about being overlooked and dismissed, about learning to find value in her own company because no one else seemed to see it. When she finished, Cade was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My wife died 5 years ago, childbirth, the baby too. I was away on a hunt, came back to find them both gone and buried. I blame myself for not being there, for choosing work over staying home. I've been moving ever since, trying to outrun the guilt." He looked at her. "You are the first person who has made me want to stop." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Ada reached across the table and took his hand. "I am sorry for your loss," she said. "And I am sorry you have carried that guilt alone for so long. But staying away would not have saved them, Cade. Sometimes terrible things just happen." He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. "How did you get so wise?" he asked, and there was wonder in his voice. She laughed, a soft, broken sound. "I'm not wise. I'm just tired of being afraid. Tired of letting other people's opinions dictate how I live. If you want to stay, then stay. If you want to go, then go. But do not make the decision based on what you think I can or cannot handle. I have survived this long on my own. I will survive whatever comes next." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "I want to stay," he said, "for as long as you will have me." That night, Ada lay in her bed and listened to Cade's breathing from his bedroll by the fire. The cabin felt different with him in it, warmer somehow, more alive. She thought about Pike and his men, about the danger they represented. She thought about the gossip that would surely intensify now that Cade was staying. And she thought about her own heart, cracked open after years of careful guarding, vulnerable in a way that terrified her. But beneath the fear was something else, hope, fragile and tentative, but growing stronger with every passing moment. She had spent so long believing she was not worth choosing. Maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Ada woke to find Cade already up, coffee made, firewood stacked. He had even started breakfast, though his cooking skills were clearly limited to basic camp fare. She took over with a smile, showing him how to make proper flapjacks. They ate together as the sun climbed, making plans for the day. They would need more ammunition, better locks for the doors, maybe even a warning system in case Pike returned. It was practical talk, survival talk, but underneath it ran a current of something deeper. They were building something together, even if neither of them dared name it yet. Winter announced its arrival with a vengeance 3 weeks after Pike and his men rode away from Ada's clearing. The first snow came down in thick, relentless waves that transformed the forest into a muffled world of white silence. Ada woke to find drifts piled against the cabin door and ice crystals blooming on the inside of the windows. Beside her the fire had burned low, and she could see her breath misting in the cold air. She rose quickly, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and set about coaxing the embers back to life. The wood caught slowly, reluctantly, but eventually flames began to dance, and heat started to spread through the small space. Cade had built himself a lean-to against the cabin's south wall, insulated with pine boughs and oiled canvas. He had insisted on it despite Ada's protests, saying it was not proper for them to share the cabin overnight, that her reputation had suffered enough without adding fuel to the gossip fires. She had argued that reputation meant nothing if he froze to death, but he had been stubborn. Now, looking out at the heavy snow, she worried. She dressed quickly, pulling on her heaviest wool dress and her father's old coat, then pushed open the door. Snow cascaded inward, and she had to shove hard to clear enough space to squeeze through. The world outside was transformed, every familiar landmark buried or disguised. The clearing was a smooth expanse of white, broken only by the dark shapes of trees bending under their frozen burden. She waded through knee-deep snow to Cade's shelter and found him already awake, sitting cross-legged with a small fire burning in a ring of stones. His breath plumed in the frigid air, and his face was ruddy with cold, but he smiled when he saw her. "Morning," he said. "Hell of a storm." "You should not be out here," she said, shivering despite her layers. "Come inside before you lose your toes to frostbite." He stood, stamping, feeling back into his feet. "Only if you let me make breakfast. Your coffee is better than mine, but my venison hash might actually be edible now." They spent the day working to secure the cabin against the cold. Cade reinforced the roof, clearing heavy snow that threatened to collapse the structure. Ada checked their food stores, taking inventory of smoked meat, dried beans, flour, and the precious coffee that would have to be rationed carefully. They had enough to last through winter if they were careful, but there was no margin for waste or disaster. By afternoon, the snow had stopped, leaving behind a landscape so bright it hurt to look at directly. The temperature dropped further as the sun sank toward the horizon, and Ada knew the real cold was just beginning. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a meal of hash and hardtack, Cade said something that had been clearly weighing on his mind. "We need to talk about Pike." Ada set down her tin plate. "I know. He has had 3 weeks to lick his wounds and plan. The fact that he has not come back yet does not mean he has given up." Cade nodded. "Men like him do not forget. They nurse grudges like other people nurse sick children. When spring comes and the pass is clear, he will be back. And he will bring more men." Ada met his eyes. "So what do we do?" "We prepare," Cade said. "We make this place defensible. And when the time comes, we make sure he knows the cost of coming after us is higher than any revenge is worth." She considered this. "You're talking about a fight." He did not flinch from her gaze. "I'm talking about survival. Pike is not the type to be reasoned with, Ada. I have known men like him. They understand strength and fear, nothing else. If we show weakness, if we run, he will hunt us down. But if we stand and make him bleed for every inch, there is a chance he will decide we are not worth the trouble." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The thought of violence, of deliberately preparing for bloodshed, made Ada's stomach turn. But she was not naive. She had seen enough of frontier life to know that sometimes gentleness was not an option. Sometimes you had to fight or be destroyed. "I will do what needs doing," she said quietly. "Just tell me what you need from me." Cade reached across the space between them and took her hand. "I need you to trust me, and I need you to know that whatever happens, I will not let him hurt you. I would die first." The intensity in his voice shook her. "Do not say that," she whispered. "Do not promise to die for me. Promise to live. Promise that we will both survive this." He squeezed her hand. "I promise to try. That is all any of us can do." They sat in silence for a while, hands clasped, watching the fire burn. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the cabin's corners, and Ada thought about the months ahead. Winter would keep Pike away for now, would give them time to prepare and fortify. But it would also trap them here together, two people still learning each other's rhythms, forced into an intimacy that might either forge them into something unbreakable or drive them apart. She glanced at Cade, at his profile lit by firelight, and felt her heart clench with an emotion she was finally ready to name. The weeks that followed settled into a routine that was both challenging and strangely comforting. They woke before dawn, worked through the short winter days, and spent the long evenings by the fire. Cade taught Ada to shoot with real accuracy, setting up targets in the clearing and drilling her until her arms ached and her ears rang. He showed her how to move quietly through snow, how to read tracks, how to think like someone trying to approach unseen. In turn, she taught him the subtleties of her healing craft. Which herbs did what, how to set a bone properly, how to recognize the signs of infection before it turned deadly. They talked more than Ada had talked to anyone in years. Cade told her about his childhood in Missouri, about parents who had died of cholera when he was 12, about raising himself in a succession of rough towns and rougher company. He told her about his years as a scout for wagon trains, about the things he had seen crossing the plains, the beauty and brutality of the frontier. And slowly, carefully, he told her more about his wife, about loving someone and losing them, about the guilt that had driven him into perpetual motion. Ada listened without judgment, offering only the quiet acceptance that came naturally to her. She, in turn, told him things she had never spoken aloud, about the shame she had felt growing up different, larger, less delicate than other girls, about the way boys had mocked her and men had ignored her, about the loneliness that had become so constant she had stopped noticing it until it was suddenly lifted. She told him about her dreams, small and practical as they were, of having enough put by to never worry about a hard winter, of maybe taking in apprentices someday and teaching them her skills, of being remembered as someone who had helped more than she had hurt. One night, as a blizzard raged outside and the cabin creaked under the assault of wind and snow, Cade looked at her across the fire and said, "You know they will talk about us in town." "They probably already are." Ada stirred the stew she was making. "Let them talk. I stopped caring what Constance Merriweather and her circle think the day Pike rode into my clearing." He smiled at that. "Still, when spring comes, people will have questions, expectations." She met his eyes. "What kind of expectations?" "The kind that come when a man and woman spend a winter alone together. The kind that assume certain things have happened whether they have or not." Ada felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not look away. "And what do you think should happen?" Cade set down the piece of leather he had been working into a new boot sole. "I think that is up to you. I will not press you, Ada. I will not take advantage of the situation we are in. But I will not lie and say I have not thought about it. About you. About what it might be like if we stopped pretending this is just two people weathering a storm together." She could barely breathe. "What are you saying, Cade?" "I am saying I love you," he said simply. "I do not know when it happened exactly. Maybe when you pulled that bullet out of me without hesitation. Maybe when you stood up to Pike with a shotgun in your hands. Maybe it was just the accumulation of 100 small moments, the way you hum when you are grinding herbs, the way you laugh when I burn the coffee, the way you look at the forest like it is something holy. I love you, Ada Finch, and I want to build a life with you. If you will have me." The words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and brave. Ada felt tears spill down her cheeks before she could stop them. She had waited her whole life to hear someone say those words to her, had given up believing they ever would. And now here was this scarred, haunted, beautiful man, offering her everything she had ever wanted, and been too afraid to ask for. She crossed the small space between them and knelt in front of him, taking his face in her hands. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been so afraid to say it, afraid you would leave, afraid I was fooling myself, but I do. I love you." He kissed her then, gentle at first, then deeper, and Ada felt something break open inside her, some last wall of defense crumbling. They held each other as the storm raged, as the fire burned low, as the night stretched long and dark around them. And for the first time in her life, Ada did not feel alone. She felt seen, chosen, loved, not despite who she was, but because of it. When they finally pulled apart, Cade rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, "not because of what people will say, not because it is proper, but because I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life and see your face. Because I want to build something with you that lasts." "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Cade Harrow, I will marry you." They spent that night talking about the future, about what they would do when spring came, about whether to stay in the cabin or build something larger. Cade wanted to expand, to add rooms, to create a real homestead. Ada wanted to formalize her practice, maybe even train others in healing arts. They talked about children, tentatively, both of them carrying scars from past losses, but willing to hope. And they talked about Pike, about the reckoning that still waited for them when the snow melted, winter deepened. The days grew shorter, the cold more intense. They burned through firewood at an alarming rate and had to make dangerous expeditions into the forest to cut more. Twice, Cade got turned around in whiteout conditions, and Ada had to ring the old bell her father had hung outside, guiding him home by sound. They rationed their food carefully, making every ounce count. It was hard living, the kind that tested both body and spirit, but they faced it together, and that made all the difference. In late February, a thaw came, brief and treacherous. The snow turned to slush, and meltwater ran in streams down every slope. Cade used the opportunity to ride into Spokane Falls for supplies they desperately needed, ammunition mainly, but also flour and coffee. Ada wanted to go with him, but he convinced her to stay, arguing that someone needed to guard the cabin and that the trails were too dangerous for two horses. She watched him ride away, with her heart in her throat, praying he would return safely. He was gone 2 days, and they were the longest 2 days of Ada's life. She kept herself busy with work, reorganizing her medicine stores, repairing clothes, anything to keep her mind occupied. But fear gnawed at her. What if Pike was in town? What if Cade ran into trouble? What if he simply decided not to come back? The doubts circled like vultures, and she hated herself for entertaining them. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching on the second evening, she ran outside without even grabbing her coat. Cade was alive and unhurt, but his face was grim. He dismounted, began unloading supplies, and Ada knew immediately something had happened. "What is it?" she asked. "What did you hear?" He handed her a sack of flour, not meeting her eyes. "Pike is dead. Someone shot him 3 weeks ago in a card game in Coeur d'Alene. His men scattered after that, went their separate ways." "The threat is over, Ada. We are safe." Relief flooded through her so powerfully her knees went weak. She sat down hard on the porch step, laughing and crying at the same time. "It is over," she repeated. "It is really over." Cade sat beside her, his arm coming around her shoulders. "I did not kill him," he said quietly. "I need you to know that. I thought about it, planned it even, but I did not have to. Someone else settled that score." Ada turned to look at him. "Does it matter who did it? He is gone. We are free." He nodded slowly, and some of the tension left his shoulders. "You are right, it is done." He pulled her closer, and they sat there on the porch as the sun set, painting the snow-covered clearing in shades of pink and gold. Ada thought about all the fear she had carried, all the preparation for a fight that would never come. Part of her felt cheated, as if they had been denied some final test. But mostly she just felt grateful. They had been given something precious, a chance to build a life without the shadow of violence hanging over it. The rest of winter passed more peacefully. With the threat of Pike gone, they could focus on the future instead of just survival. Cade expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a larger workspace for Ada's medicines. She began planning a garden that would be 3 times the size of her old one, ambitious and full of hope. They talked about getting married in the spring, about who to invite, about whether to have a big ceremony or something small and private. Ada favored small, uncomfortable with the idea of being the center of attention, but Cade argued that she deserved to be celebrated. In early March, a traveling preacher came through the territory, a Methodist circuit rider who held services in Spokane Falls once a season. Cade rode into town and convinced the man to come out to the cabin to perform the ceremony. It was not traditional, not what anyone would have expected, but it was theirs. On a clear, cold morning, with the snow beginning to melt and the first brave crocuses pushing through the frozen ground, Ada Finch and Cade Harrow stood in front of the preacher and pledged their lives to each other. There were no guests except for Thomas Ridley and his sister Mary, who had insisted on coming to thank Ada again for saving their lives. Mary brought wildflowers, the first of the season, and Thomas stood awkwardly in his Sunday best, grinning as the preacher spoke the words that bound Ada and Cade together. When it was done, when they had exchanged simple gold bands that Cade had commissioned from the town blacksmith, Ada looked at her husband and felt a joy so complete it almost frightened her. This was real. This was hers. No one could take it away. That night, as they lay together in their new bedroom, Cade traced the curve of her face with his fingers. "I never thought I would feel this again," he said softly. "This kind of peace, this kind of rightness." Ada kissed his palm. "Neither did I. I thought I was meant to be alone." He pulled her closer. "You were never meant to be alone. You were just waiting for someone worthy of what you had to give. And I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be that person." Spring came in earnest after that, transforming the world from white to green almost overnight. The river thawed with a roar, and the forest exploded with life. Birds returned, deer emerged from their winter hiding places, and the air filled with the smell of growing things. Ada planted her garden, and Cade built fences to keep out the deer and rabbits. They worked side by side, building something that would last, something that was theirs. One afternoon in early April, as Ada was transplanting seedlings, she heard voices from the trail. She straightened, shading her eyes, and saw a group of people approaching. Her stomach tightened with old anxiety, but then she recognized faces. Thomas and Mary Ridley, Mrs. Ridley, and, surprisingly, several other families from the area. They came bearing gifts, practical things mostly. A bag of seed potatoes, a laying hen, a bolt of good fabric. Mrs. Ridley explained that word had spread about the wedding, about Cade staying, about the life they were building. The community wanted to help, to show that whatever gossip had come before, they recognized something worth supporting when they saw it. Ada was overwhelmed, unused to such kindness. She invited them all in, served coffee and the last of her winter stores, and listened as they talked about crops and weather and the small dramas of frontier life. Cade stood beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back, and she realized that they were no longer outsiders. They had become part of something larger, a community that might not always understand them, but would stand with them nonetheless. As the guests finally left and evening settled over the clearing, Ada stood on her porch and looked out at everything they had built. The expanded cabin, the new garden, the life they were creating together. She thought about the woman she had been just months ago, alone and convinced of her own unworthiness. And she thought about the woman she was now, loved and loving, strong in ways she had never imagined. Cade came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered. He turned her to face him, his eyes serious. "We have built something good here, Ada, something worth protecting. Whatever comes next, we will face it together." She nodded, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Together," she agreed. "Always together." And as the sun set over the Spokane Valley, painting the sky in shades of fire and hope, Ada Finch Harrow knew that whatever trials still lay ahead, she would never again face them alone. Summer arrived with a fury that caught even the old-timers by surprise, bringing heat that shimmered off the rocks and turned the river low and sluggish. Ada worked her garden in the early mornings and late evenings, avoiding the punishing midday sun that could blister exposed skin in minutes. Her plants thrived despite the heat, beans climbing their poles, squash spreading across the ground in great green waves, tomatoes hanging heavy on their vines. She had never grown so much food, had never dared to plant with such confidence in the future. Every seed she put in the ground was an act of faith, a declaration that she and Cade would be here to harvest what they had sown. Cade spent his days hunting and trapping, but also doing something Ada had not expected. He began taking contracts from nearby ranches, tracking wolves that threatened livestock, scouting for water sources, guiding families new to the territory. Word had spread that Cade Harrow was a man who knew the wilderness better than most, and people were willing to pay for that knowledge. The money was not much, but it was steady, and it allowed them to buy things they could not make or grow themselves. More importantly, it gave Cade a purpose beyond simple survival, a way to use his skills that did not involve running or violence. Their cabin became a place people visited now, not just in emergencies but socially. Mary Ridley stopped by once a week with her baby, a healthy boy she had named Samuel, bringing news from town and staying for tea. Other women came too, drawn by curiosity at first, but then by genuine friendship. They wanted to learn Ada's healing methods, wanted her recipes for salves and tinctures, wanted her advice on ailments both serious and trivial. Ada taught them freely, sharing knowledge her mother had given her, knowledge that should not die with one person. She began to see herself not just as a healer, but as a keeper of important traditions, a bridge between generations. One afternoon in late July, as Ada was showing 3 women how to prepare a poultice for infection, a rider came hard up the trail. It was a boy Ada did not recognize, maybe 13, his horse lathered and blowing. He slid from the saddle and ran to the porch. "Miss Ada," he gasped, "my pa sent me. There has been an accident at the lumber camp up north. A tree fell wrong and crushed 2 men. They need help bad." Ada was already moving, her mind shifting into the focused calm that came with medical crisis. "Tell me about their injuries," she said as she grabbed her largest medical bag and began filling it with supplies. The boy described what he knew: crushed legs on one man, chest injuries on the other, both bleeding heavily. She looked at the women who had been learning from her. "I need to go. Can one of you ride to find Cade and tell him where I have gone?" A sturdy woman named Margaret nodded. "I will find him. You go." Ada mounted her horse and followed the boy north at a pace that was just short of reckless. The lumber camp was a good 10 miles away, and every minute mattered. She tried not to think about what she might find when she arrived, tried not to calculate the odds of saving men with injuries like the boy had described. She just rode, her bag bouncing against her back, her mind already running through procedures and priorities. The camp was chaos when she arrived. Men stood in clusters, talking in low, urgent voices. The injured had been carried to the cook tent, laid out on tables. Ada dismounted and pushed through the crowd without ceremony. "Let me through. I am a healer. Move." Inside the tent, she found exactly what she had feared. The first man, a logger named Brennan, had both legs crushed below the knee. The bones were shattered, flesh torn, blood everywhere. The second man, younger, maybe 20, had taken a heavy branch to the chest. His breathing was shallow and labored, and when Ada pressed her ear to his ribs, she heard the wet rattle that meant punctured lung. She assessed quickly, coldly, pushing emotion aside. Brennan would lose his legs. There was no saving them, not out here with what she had. But she could save his life if she acted fast. The younger man, whose name she learned was Joseph, had a chance if she could stabilize his breathing. She turned to the camp foreman. "I need clean water boiled. I need every lamp you have brought here for light, and I need the strongest men you have to hold these patients down. Do it now." The foreman, to his credit, did not question her. He barked orders and men jumped to obey. Ada worked through the afternoon and into the evening, her hands steady even as her heart raced. She amputated Brennan's legs below the knee, sawing through bone and cauterizing blood vessels with a heated blade. The man screamed through the leather strap between his teeth, then mercifully passed out. She stitched and bandaged with methodical precision, then turned to Joseph. His lung had collapsed, and she had to insert a hollow reed between his ribs to let the trapped air escape. It was a dangerous procedure, one she had only done twice before, and both times the patient had died anyway. But she had to try. As she worked, she became aware of someone standing beside her. She glanced up to find Cade, his face drawn with worry. "Margaret found me," he said quietly. "What do you need?" "Another pair of hands," she said. "Hold this reed steady while I secure it." He did as she asked without hesitation, his hands as steady as hers. Together they stabilized Joseph, got his breathing closer to normal, packed his wounds. When it was done, when both men were as stable as she could make them, Ada stepped outside the tent and nearly collapsed. Cade caught her, held her upright. "You did it," he said. "You saved them both." "We do not know that yet," she said, her voice shaking with exhaustion. "Infection could still take them. Brennan will never walk again. Joseph might never breathe right." Cade turned her to face him. "But they are alive. Because of you. That matters, Ada, that matters more than anything." She nodded, too tired to argue, and let him lead her to a quiet spot by the river where she could wash the blood from her hands. The water was cold and clear, and she scrubbed until her skin was raw, trying to wash away not just the physical evidence of what she had done, but the emotional weight of it. She had held men's lives in her hands today, had made choices that would shape the rest of their existence. The responsibility was crushing. They stayed at the camp that night, Ada checking on her patients every few hours. Brennan developed a fever toward morning, but she managed to bring it down with willow bark tea and cold compresses. Joseph's breathing remained stable, a small miracle. When dawn broke, the camp foreman approached Ada with his hat in his hands. "Miss Harrow," he said, using her married name with careful respect. "The company wants to pay you for what you did. Name your price." Ada was so tired she could barely think. "I do not want money," she said, "but those men will need care for weeks. Send them to my cabin when they can be moved. I will see them through recovery." The foreman looked relieved. "We will pay for their keep then, and for supplies. Whatever you need." She nodded, accepting this because she knew she would need help caring for 2 seriously injured men. Cade loaded her medical bag onto her horse, and they rode home slowly, Ada swaying in the saddle. When they reached the cabin, he carried her inside, laid her on their bed, and pulled off her boots. "Sleep," he said. "I will wake you if anything needs your attention." She was unconscious before he finished speaking. She woke 12 hours later to find the cabin filled with the smell of cooking food. She stumbled into the main room to find Cade at the stove with Margaret and 2 other women from the community. They had brought supplies, were preparing the cabin to receive the injured men, had taken it upon themselves to help without being asked. Ada felt tears prick her eyes at the kindness of it. When the women saw she was awake, they mobbed her with questions and concern. She answered as best she could, still foggy with exhaustion, and accepted the bowl of stew Margaret pressed into her hands. Over the next 3 weeks, the cabin became a hospital. Brennan and Joseph were transported down from the lumber camp on a wagon fitted with a mattress. Ada tended them with relentless dedication, changing bandages, administering medicines, watching for signs of infection. Cade built a small addition onto the cabin to house the patients, giving them privacy and giving Ada and himself back their bedroom. Women from the community took turns sitting with the injured men, freeing Ada to rest and maintain her regular practice. Brennan struggled with the loss of his legs, falling into a depression that worried Ada more than his physical wounds. She sat with him for hours, talking about what life could still hold, about the logging camp that had promised him work in the office once he recovered, about the woman back in Ohio who had promised to wait for him. Slowly, painfully, he began to accept his new reality. Joseph recovered faster, his youth and strength working in his favor. His lung healed, and though he would never have full capacity again, he could breathe and work and live. When both men were finally well enough to leave, the lumber company sent a generous payment and a letter of gratitude that Ada tucked away without reading. News of what Ada had done spread through the territory like wildfire. Suddenly, people were riding from 20-30 miles away, seeking her help for ailments both serious and minor. She found herself overwhelmed with patients, unable to keep up with demand. Cade suggested she take on an apprentice, someone young and eager to learn who could help with the simpler cases. The idea appealed to Ada, and she put word out through her network of women. Within a week, a girl named Eliza showed up at the cabin. Eliza was 17, plain-faced and serious, with capable hands and a fierce intelligence in her eyes. Her family was poor, too poor to provide a dowry, and her prospects for marriage were slim. But she had helped her mother birth 6 siblings, had nursed her father through pneumonia, and had a natural talent for healing. Ada took one look at her and knew she had found what she was looking for. Eliza moved into the cabin, sleeping in the corner Ada designated for her, and threw herself into learning with a hunger that reminded Ada of herself at that age. As summer turned to autumn, Ada found a rhythm that worked. She taught Eliza everything she knew, shared her knowledge freely and completely. The girl was a quick study, picking up skills in weeks that had taken Ada months to master. Together, they treated the steady stream of patients, Ada handling the serious cases, Eliza managing the minor ones under supervision. Cade built a proper clinic attached to the cabin, a separate structure with its own entrance where patients could wait and be treated without invading their living space. One evening in October, as the aspens turned gold and the air grew crisp, Ada and Cade sat on their porch watching the sunset. Eliza was inside studying one of Ada's precious medical texts by lamplight. "We have built something remarkable here," Cade said quietly. "This place is more than a home now. It is a refuge, a place where people know they can come for help." Ada leaned against him, content. "I never imagined my life could be like this. I spent so many years believing I was meant to be alone, meant to serve, but never to be valued. You showed me I was wrong." He kissed the top of her head. "We showed each other. I was lost before I found you, Ada, running from ghosts, convinced I did not deserve a second chance at happiness. You gave me that chance. You gave me a reason to stop moving and start building." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Cade said, "I have been thinking about the future, about what comes next for us." Ada smiled. "We have barely figured out the present." He laughed. "True enough. But I want you to know that whatever you want, whatever dreams you have, I will help you achieve them. If you want to build a real hospital, we will do it. If you want to travel and learn from other healers, we will make it happen. Your dreams are my dreams now." Ada turned to look at him, her heart full to bursting. "Right now my dream is this. This cabin, this life, this man sitting beside me. Everything else is just details." He pulled her close, and they sat there as darkness fell and stars began to emerge, two people who had been broken and alone, now whole and together. Inside the cabin, Eliza called out a question about the properties of comfrey root, and Ada laughed. Though even she admitted, having an apprentice is turning out to be more exhausting than I expected. Winter came again, gentler this time, as if the land had spent its fury the previous year. Ada and Cade settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. They had their disagreements, moments of friction that came from two strong-willed people learning to share space, but they worked through them with honesty and patience. Eliza proved invaluable during the long winter months, taking on more responsibility as her skills grew. By spring, she was handling most routine cases on her own, freeing Ada to focus on the more complex medical challenges that came their way. In March, Ada discovered she was pregnant. The realization came slowly, a series of small signs she recognized from her work with other women, but had been afraid to acknowledge in herself. When she finally told Cade, his face went through a series of emotions so quickly she could barely track them. Joy, fear, wonder, terror. He pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Are you certain?" he whispered. "I'm certain," she said. "Are you happy?" He pulled back to look at her, and she saw tears in his eyes. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "After what happened to my first wife, to my first child, I am so afraid of losing you. But yes, Ada, I am happy. I am so incredibly happy." She took his face in her hands. "I'm strong," she said. "I am healthy, and I am a healer. I know the risks, and I know how to manage them. We will get through this together." He nodded, not entirely convinced, but willing to trust her. Over the following months, as her belly swelled and the baby grew, Cade became almost absurdly protective, refusing to let her lift anything heavy, insisting she rest more than she wanted to. Ada found his concern both touching and exasperating. She continued working well into her pregnancy, though she let Eliza take on more of the physical demands of healing. The women of the community rallied around her, bringing food, sewing baby clothes, sharing their own stories of childbirth. Ada realized she had become part of something larger than herself, part of a network of women who supported each other through the trials of frontier life. It was a gift she had never expected, this sense of belonging. When her time came in late autumn, Ada labored for 18 hours. Eliza assisted, her hands steady and sure, while Margaret and Mary Ridley took turns encouraging and supporting. Cade paced outside, his face grey with fear, until finally, as the sun set on a golden October evening, Ada brought their daughter into the world. The baby was small but healthy, with a powerful set of lungs and her father's grey eyes. When Cade was finally allowed in, when he held his daughter for the first time, he wept openly, all his fear and grief and joy pouring out in tears he had held back for years. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that grew around the cabin each summer. She was a good baby, healthy and alert, and she transformed their lives in ways both expected and surprising. Ada found motherhood challenging, the constant demands of an infant combined with her healing work stretching her thin. But Cade was a devoted father, taking on more than his share of nighttime feedings and diaper changes. And Eliza proved to be a natural with babies, often taking Rose when Ada needed to focus on a patient. As winter settled in again, Ada sat by the fire one evening with Rose nursing at her breast, Cade mending harness nearby, Eliza studying at the table. She looked around at the life they had built, at the family they had become, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. She thought about the woman she had been just 2 years ago, alone and convinced of her own inadequacy. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. Ada Finch Harrow was loved, valued, essential. She had a husband who cherished her, a daughter who depended on her, an apprentice who looked up to her, and a community that respected her. She had become everything she had never dared to dream she could be. Cade looked up from his work and caught her watching him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "Everything," she said. "How far we have come. How different my life is now. How grateful I am for every moment that led me to you." He set aside his work and came to sit beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "I am the one who should be grateful. You saved my life in more ways than one." She leaned into him, careful not to disturb the nursing baby. "We saved each other," she said. "That is what love does." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and steady, covering the world in white silence. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, and Rose made small, contented sounds. Eliza turned a page in her book, completely absorbed. And Ada closed her eyes, holding this moment close, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever trials the future held, they would face them together. She had found her place in the world, had claimed her worth, and built a life that mattered. And that, she thought as sleep began to claim her, was more than enough. It was everything. 3 years passed like water over stones, each season wearing away the sharp edges of the past until what remained was smooth and precious. The cabin that had once housed only Ada's solitude had grown, a proper addition with 2 bedrooms, an expanded clinic with separate examination and recovery rooms, and a small workshop where Cade crafted furniture during the long winter months. The clearing had been transformed from a solitary refuge into a place of healing and community, a destination people sought out from across the territory. Ada stood in the doorway of the clinic on a spring morning, watching her daughter play in the yard. Rose was nearly 3 now, a sturdy child with her father's grey eyes and her mother's practical nature. She was crouched in the dirt, examining a beetle with intense concentration, occasionally calling out observations in her high, clear voice. The sight made Ada's chest swell with a love so fierce it sometimes frightened her. She had never imagined this life, this happiness, this sense of rightness that filled every ordinary moment. Inside the clinic, Eliza was examining a trapper who had gashed his arm on a broken trap. The girl had blossomed into a confident healer, her skills now approaching Ada's own. She handled routine cases independently, freeing Ada to focus on the more complex medical challenges and to spend more time with Rose. They had taken on a second apprentice as well, a quiet young woman named Catherine, who showed remarkable promise with difficult births. The 3 of them had delivered 17 babies in the past year alone, and only 1 had been lost, a tragedy that still haunted Ada in quiet moments. Cade emerged from the barn leading a newly broken horse, his movements easy and confident. He had aged slightly in 3 years, a few more lines around his eyes, a hint of silver at his temples, but he remained strong and vital. His reputation had grown alongside Ada's. People sought him out to guide hunting parties, to track lost livestock, to mediate disputes with the native tribes whose territory bordered the settlements. He had become a bridge between worlds, trusted by both sides, respected for his fairness and his refusal to take advantage. He caught her watching and smiled, that same crooked smile that still made her heart skip. "Admiring the view, Mrs. Harrow," he called. "Always," she called back. Rose looked up from her beetle and shrieked with delight. "Papa, come see what I found." Cade tied off the horse and crossed to crouch beside his daughter, examining the insect with exaggerated interest. Ada watched them together, her two greatest treasures, and felt gratitude wash over her in waves. A rider appeared on the trail, and Ada recognized Thomas Ridley immediately. He was 23 now, recently appointed as a deputy marshal. His boyish features hardened into the serious face of a man who had seen difficult things. He dismounted and approached with his hat in his hands. "Miss Ada Cade," he said formally, "I need your help with a delicate situation." Ada gestured for him to continue. "There is a family squatting on disputed land up near the North Pass. They have a sick child, fever and rash. The landowner is threatening to force them out, but the child is too ill to be moved. I was hoping you might come assess the situation." Ada did not hesitate. "Let me get my supplies. Eliza, can you manage here for the day?" The younger woman nodded confidently. "Take what you need. I will handle anything that comes up." Within minutes, Ada had packed her medical bag and was riding north with Thomas and Cade, who refused to let her go without him. The trail wound through dense forest, climbing steadily until they reached a crude shelter beside a rushing creek. A man and woman stood guard outside, their faces drawn with worry and defiance. Ada approached slowly, keeping her movements calm and unthreatening. "My name is Ada Harrow. I am a healer. May I examine your child?" The woman's hard expression cracked, revealing desperate hope beneath. "Please," she whispered. "We have tried everything we know." Inside the shelter, Ada found a girl of perhaps 7, burning with fever, covered in the distinctive rash of scarlet fever. She worked quickly, applying cool compresses, preparing fever-reducing teas from her supplies, monitoring the child's labored breathing. Cade stood nearby, ready to assist, while Thomas kept watch outside. As Ada worked, she learned the family's story. They had been promised land by a dishonest agent, had built their shelter before discovering the deception. Now they had nowhere to go and no resources to start over. The father was a skilled blacksmith, the mother an experienced seamstress, but without a home base they could not practice their trades. Ada made a decision quickly, knowing Cade would support her. "Stay at our place while your daughter recovers," she said. "We have room in the old cabin. My husband can always use help with metalwork, and I know a dozen women who would pay well for skilled sewing. Save your wages, find proper land, start fresh." The couple stared at her as if she had offered them salvation itself. The mother began to weep, and the father gripped Ada's hand with calloused fingers. "We will work hard," he promised. "We will not be a burden." Ada smiled. Every person who needs help is worth helping. That is what community means. By evening, the child's fever had broken enough to risk moving her. They made the journey back slowly, arriving at Ada's compound after dark. The old cabin had been prepared by neighbors who had somehow heard the news and gathered to help, as they always did. The family settled in quickly. The father began working with Cade, repairing tools and equipment that had been neglected. The mother started taking in sewing work, her skilled hands producing garments that quickly became sought after. And the daughter, recovering steadily under Ada's care, became a playmate for Rose, the two girls forming the kind of instant friendship that only children can manage. Watching them play together, Ada felt the deep satisfaction of living according to her principles. One evening, a few weeks later, as Ada and Cade sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, he took her hand. "We have built something remarkable here," he said quietly. "In just 3 years, this place has become a refuge for people who have nowhere else to turn." Ada leaned against him, breathing in the familiar scent of him, wood smoke and leather and home. "We did it together," she said. "Everything we have is because we chose each other." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have been thinking about the future, about making sure what we have built continues even after we are gone." Ada looked at him curiously. "We have many years ahead of us yet." He smiled. "I know, but I want to establish this place formally as a healing clinic, deed the land, so it always remains a place where people can receive care, regardless of their ability to pay. Make it a legacy that outlasts us both." The idea took Ada's breath away. "That would mean everything," she whispered. Over the following months, they worked with Thomas to draw up the legal documents. The Harrow Healing Clinic would be established as a permanent institution, managed by a rotating board of community members, funded by those who could pay, but never turning away those who could not. Eliza would eventually take over as head healer, training successive generations in the same methods Ada had learned from her mother and refined through years of practice. The knowledge would be preserved, passed down, a living legacy of compassion. On a bright afternoon in early autumn, the clinic held a ceremony to mark its formal establishment. People came from across the territory, patients Ada had treated, families she had helped, neighbors who had become friends. There were speeches, praising her work, but Ada felt uncomfortable with the attention. She kept thinking about the woman she had been just 3 years earlier, alone and convinced of her own inadequacy. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime. As the celebration wound down, an elderly woman approached Ada. It took a moment before Ada recognized Constance Merriweather, now frail and bent with age. The woman's eyes were damp with tears. "I came to apologize," she said softly, "for the cruel things I said to you years ago, for making you feel less than you were. You have built something beautiful here, Ada, something that will help people for generations. I was wrong about you, and I am deeply sorry." Ada felt her own eyes fill with tears. She reached out and took the old woman's hand. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for saying that." Constance squeezed her fingers gently. "You are a better person than I could ever hope to be. You turned pain into purpose. That is the rarest gift of all." That night, after Rose was tucked into bed and the compound was quiet, Ada and Cade walked down to the river where he had first camped 3 years earlier. The water ran dark and silver under the moon, and the forest whispered its eternal songs. Cade pulled her close, his arms warm and strong around her. "I love you," he said, "for seeing worth in a wounded stranger, for standing beside me when danger came, for building this life with me." Ada turned in his arms to face him. "I love you for seeing me when I thought I was invisible, for staying when you could have run, for choosing me every single day." They stood together in the darkness, two souls who had been broken and then remade, who had found in each other the courage to hope for more than survival. The years ahead would bring challenges and joys in equal measure. The clinic would grow, serving hundreds and then thousands. Rose would grow up surrounded by healing and compassion, learning from her mother's example. More families would find refuge in the clearing. More lives would be saved by skilled and caring hands. But the heart of it all, the belief that every person deserved dignity and care, that would remain constant. It was Ada's gift to the future, born from her own loneliness and pain, forged in the fire of love and purpose. Standing by the river, with her husband's arms around her, and the sound of the water singing its ancient song, Ada thought about the journey that had brought her here. From invisible to essential, from dismissed to valued, from alone to beloved. She had learned that worth was not something granted by others, but something claimed from within. That love was not earned through perfection, but given freely between imperfect souls who chose to see each other clearly. And that a life built on compassion and courage could change the world in small but lasting ways. Above them, stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, indifferent to human struggles. But here on earth, in this clearing carved from wilderness, two people had created something precious. A home, a healing place, a legacy of mercy that would endure long after they were gone. And that, Ada thought as Cade kissed her temple and Rose called out in her sleep from the cabin. That was more than enough. It was everything. Retry. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.